To conclude this alternate universe of Se7en, in which the doctrine has fractured, Somerset has become a symbol of remembrance, and Mills has helped usher in a painful but authentic rebirth of humanity. This final passage will explore the long-term consequences, the spiritual aftermath, and the legacy of all three characters. Years passed, not in silence, not in stillness, in motion. Life returned not as a roaring flood, but as rain, steady, sometimes violent, sometimes thin and hesitant, but always falling. It washed the world of its sterile calm, eroded the smooth surfaces where the doctrine had etched obedience into every corner of existence. In its place came rust, laughter, trembling, contradiction, what the progenitor had once called chaos, but which the world now recognized as life. Cities were different, not rebuilt, reclaimed. Streets no longer bore numbers, but names chosen by memory, not power. Murals appeared on stone walls. Paintings of people who had never existed in official records, but who now lived in color, in form, in expression. Some of the faces were twisted with rage or sorrow. Others smiled, toothless and crooked. They were real. The new currency of the world was authenticity, not order. In the North Quarter, a man had taken to reading stories aloud in a public square. People gathered every night, sitting on cracked pavement beneath flickering lights, listening not to tales of victory or virtue, but stories where nothing resolved, where people made terrible choices and survived them. His voice was gravel, low, and broken. He had been a factory worker once, then a believer in the doctrine. Now he was a librarian of suffering, and the people came, night after night, because in every imperfect story he read they found themselves. The child no longer called, the progenitor walked the earth without ceremony. He was not pursued, he was not worshipped. People recognized him. Sometimes they stared, some turned away, a few wept, but none bowed. He passed through towns like a wandering monk, quiet, thoughtful, changed. Children no longer flinched from him. They offered him drawings. They told him about their parents, their scraped knees, their dreams. One girl handed him a picture she'd made in crayon, a crooked house with smoke rising from the chimney, a sun with a smiling face, and three figures, one tall, one medium, and one small. "This is me," she said. "This is my mummy, and this is you." He stared at it. "I don't live with you." She shrugged. "You could," he cried that night. Not from guilt, not from longing, but from a sudden, terrible joy. Because it was the first time he'd been seen not as a symbol, not as a weapon, not as a chapter in a book, but as a person. Someone who might live in a house, someone who might be drawn in crayon. He never returned to the towers. They stood empty, like tombs. People left them alone. No monuments were built to Somerset. No statues. No churches. But in the world that followed, his name was spoken in quiet reverence. Teachers spoke of him not as a savior, but as a reminder that seeing clearly even when it hurts is the first act of courage. His writings, once scattered across timelines, now formed a body of work, studied, not for doctrine, but for guidance. Observe, but never forget you're part of the world you see. He had once written. That line was carved into the entryway of every new courthouse, and Mills. David grew older. He kept to his bookstore apartment in the outer edge of the city, away from the center, where people still argued over policy and power. He wrote letters by hand, to no one. He taught children the structure of stories, not to control them, but to break them when needed. Some days he walked to the memorial grove. There were no names carved there, just trees planted for those who had been forgotten by the rewrite. Those whose pain had been scrubbed from reality, and then allowed, finally, to be remembered. One tree stood apart. It bore a ribbon of Violet Tracy. She had not returned. Not really, not the way he once hoped. The version of her that had walked beside him in the rewrite was a ghost of grace, built by silence. But he had felt something beyond illusion in her. A last kindness. A goodbye that was allowed to matter. He sat beneath her tree and spoke aloud sometimes. Of nothing and everything. Of the days before the doctrine. Of the box in the desert. Of the silence that had once threatened to unmake the world and the scream that had cracked it open. One afternoon, a boy approached him. Not a child. A teenager, maybe 15. His eyes dark, familiar. "You're Mills. Yes. I. Single quotes. We've been looking for you." "Why?" "Because I have the dreams." Mills nodded slowly. "Come sit." They sat on the bench together. Wind moved through the grove like breath. "What do you see?" Mills asked. "A house. It's falling apart. But I keep trying to fix it. And there's a man inside. He won't leave. He says it's where the story ends. Mills was silent for a moment. Do you believe him? The boy shook his head. I think he's wrong. Why? Because if it ended, we wouldn't be dreaming about it. Mills smiled. Exactly. They sat there until night fell later. The boy would write a story. It would be published by hand, distributed by word of mouth, and passed between strangers on trains, folded into envelopes, hidden in coat pockets. It would be a strange story, full of unresolved loss and flickering hope. In it, the world ends every morning and begins again every night. It wouldn't be a bestseller, but it would be remembered. Elsewhere, in a valley beneath the shattered remains of the Doctrine's central archive, a woman found a page that had survived the purge. It was blank, except for one line at the bottom. The truth is not what saves us. It's what allows us to choose how to live with what we've done. She framed it, hung it in a window, that the rain fell. The world turned, and in the places between dreams, where all stories waited for their tellers, Se7en watched. Not to judge, not to intervene, only to witness. Because even in a world rewritten, the act of witnessing remains sacred, and as long as someone, somewhere, remembered, the page could never truly be closed. Not this story, not ever. The age of stillness ended. That's what people called the era between the rewrite and the rupture, the stillness. A time of smooth days and quiet faces, when crime ceased, war dissolved. And no one remembered what they had traded for the calm. They hadn't been forced. The Doctrine had asked, gently, if they would give up pain. And they had. Willingly. Now they knew the price. The reckoners were born from it. Not warriors, not rebels. Witnesses. They traveled the land telling stories that had been erased. Some were small, the way a woman used to braid her daughter's hair. Others were terrible. The man who had killed his brother out of jealousy, and how the silence, afterward, had nearly killed him too. But they told them anyway. Without judgment, because stories, they believed, were what kept a world from folding into itself. And the child the progenitor watched from a distance. He no longer lived in the tower. He wondered the Doctrine still existed, but only in fragments, whispered by those too frightened to let go. Most had turned away, not because they hated him, but because they wanted to feel again. Even agony, even shame. He tried to understand. He read poetry. He watched lovers argue in public. He let himself feel hunger and fear. Once he stood outside a hospital and listened to the sound of a woman mourning behind the walls. It undid him, not all at once, but like unraveling thread. He found a child, real, human, sitting by a fountain, crying over a broken toy. He sat beside her. Why are you crying? It was a simple question. She looked at him and said, because I loved it. And he felt something like pain, not his, hers, echoing inside him. He didn't speak again for a long time. Se7en's presence became more than metaphor. People saw him in reflections, in the silence before dawn, in the final words of books that hadn't been opened in decades. He had become the archetype of remembrance, not a ghost, not divine, just conscience. A reminder that evil, once known, must be faced, not erased. And then one day, the Doctrine shattered fully. No explosion, no declaration. Just one morning, everyone woke and felt everything they had ever lost. It came in like a tide. Mothers remembered, children stillborn. Men remembered crimes committed. And never atoned lovers remembered the silence between last words. And they wept. The streets were full of people, holding each other, strangers apologizing for things they didn't understand. Families rebuilding from fragments. No utopia followed. Just humanity. Flawed. Grieving. Alive. Mills returned to the city. After that, he didn't speak publicly. He found a small apartment above a bookstore. He taught children to write stories. And when they asked him, what kind, he said, true ones, even the hard ones, especially those. And when the sun set each night, he watched the light cast shadows through crooked alleyways and reminded himself that darkness wasn't the enemy. It was the contrast that let light be seen in time. People forgot the Doctrine's name, but they remembered the rupture. They remembered the choice. And they remembered the man who had once shouted into the abyss and refused to let silence win. The world did not end when Mills plunged memory into the heart of the Doctrine. It didn't collapse or burst into flame. It tilted imperceptibly at first, like a ship slightly off balance in a still sea. But slowly, irrevocably, the water began to pour in. People woke from lives they didn't remember choosing, not all at once. It started in dreams. A man in Tokyo began to draw the face of a woman he swore he'd never met, but who appeared. in his dreams every night, with the same scar above her lip. A child in Paris recited a poem in a language that hadn't been spoken in 8 centuries. A nurse in Detroit looked into a mirror and saw herself as she truly was, older, heavier, her smile honest, not the thin, symmetrical thing that had been affixed to her face since the rewrite. These were the cracks. They grew like veins under the surface of a frozen lake. The doctrine tried to patch them. News reports shifted narratives. Artists vanished. Schools revised syllabi overnight. But the rupture Mills had made wasn't physical. It wasn't even temporal. It was emotional. And that kind of wound festers. The boy, the one who had become the vessel of the rewrite, stood at the epicenter of it all, still, pale, perfect, watching from a high tower of glass at the heart of the reformed capital. He had no name anymore. Names invited intimacy. He was called only the progenitor. Where he walked, people wept or worshipped. Some spontaneously screamed. Others fell into trance. His presence no longer soothed. It haunted. He had shaped a world without pain, but also without truth. And now that truth had found its way back in. He summoned the architects. There were fewer now. Some had disappeared after the rupture. Others had become erratic, wandering the corridors of government buildings, murmuring riddles about loops and ladders. Those that remained bowed before him, silent, maskless. Their faces were blank, not from design, but exhaustion. He looked at them. Why do they remember? No one answered. He turned to the window. If the memory persists, we must find its source. They searched. Drones swept the land. Archives were scanned. Deep memory indexes were burned clean. But the infection spread not through data but feeling. In the Cradle District, a woman remembered the pain of childbirth and wept with joy for the first time in her life. In the library spiral, a page reappeared in a censored novel, a single line describing heartbreak so vividly that readers fainted from empathy. Emotion returned, slow, irregular, raw. It surged into places the rewrite had sterilized: grief in hospitals, laughter at funerals, yearning in classrooms. And then the dreams changed. Se7en returned, not bodily, not as a spirit, as a presence in the minds of thousands. He walked quietly beside them, saying nothing, only handing them books, journals, pages torn from forgotten lives. And when they woke, they remembered their real names, not assigned identities. Their names. In the underground, where the index had once been a secretive resistance, it became something else. A movement. Sprawling, scattered, human. They no longer met in sewers or beneath railways. They met in cafes, in quiet libraries, in eye contact exchanged between strangers who knew something had cracked and wanted to feel the split run through them. They shared stories, true stories, even painful ones, especially painful ones, because pain had become the last proof that they were real. Mills didn't return to the surface. He stayed in the desert cathedral, now collapsed, now open to sky. He meditated at the site of the rupture, surrounded by pages carried on the wind. He didn't speak for days. When he did, his voice had changed. Not deeper, not louder, more anchored. He had become something the doctrine could not quantify, a scar that refused to fade. People found him. Pilgrims. They called themselves survivors of the rewrite. They came not for healing, but for remembrance. They wanted to feel everything, even the worst, especially the worst. They called him the Scar Prophet. He rejected the title, but not the mission, because truth, he now believed, was not comfort. It was confrontation. One day, the progenitor came to him, not with armies, not with symbols. Alone, sat together in the ruins. The wind was hot. The sand bleached. The child looked older. Time had begun to touch him, not with wrinkles, but with weight. His eyes had shadows. His lips were dry. Why did you do it? Mills didn't speak at first. Then because perfection without pain is prison. The child nodded. I gave them peace. No, Mills said. You gave them numbness. They sat in silence. The child lowered his head. Then what now? Now you become what you stopped others from becoming. The child looked up. What's that? Real. And with those words, Mills stood and left him there. He didn't look back. The child did not cry. But for the first time, he blinked without symmetry. And the world tilted again. This time, towards something not written, but felt. Mills woke with no memory of his own screams. The room around him was soft, pale gray, padded walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. A window showed a world outside that looked like his own, but not quite. The skyline a little too uniform, the sun hovering too still, clouds frozen like oil on water. He sat up slowly, legs shaking, and noticed his arms bore no scars, no signs of restraint or trauma. His clothes were new, not hospital garb. A simple button-down shirt, soft jeans, shoes without laces. A mirror across the room showed him his face, clean-shaven, hair neat, not a line out of place. But his eyes were wrong, too hollow, as though someone had edited his soul. A gentle knock came. The door opened. A woman entered. Tracy. She looked exactly as he remembered, but younger, untouched by grief. Her eyes were bright, her smile warm. She spoke to him, as though they had never lost each other, as though they had simply woken from a shared dream. Behind her came a boy. Daddy. The word struck him like a bullet to the heart. He dropped to his knees, but something inside him screamed, not in joy, not in recognition, in suspicion. They were too perfect. Their movements too precise, like actors in a play he hadn't rehearsed. The boy approached, touched his face. His hand was cold, not cruel, not loving, just absent. Mills stared into his eyes, and remembered blood. Doe on his knees. Somerset, whispering not yet, the box. And then the word. Remember. That word, it echoed in him, grew louder, broke something. He stood suddenly, backing away from them. Where am I? Tracy looked confused. The boy tilted his head. You're home, David. He didn't believe it. He stepped toward the window, pressed his forehead to the glass. Outside, people walked in formations. Not quite military, not quite human. They moved with eerie synchrony, blinking in rhythm. A billboard flashed without message, just a symbol, a perfect circle broken at the top. A camera watched him from the ceiling. He turned. This isn't real. Tracy's smile faltered. The boy blinked slowly. You asked for peace. This is what peace looks like. Mills stumbled out the door. No one stopped him. No alarms. Just more white holes. More blank faces. Everyone he passed smiled, spoke in gentle, meaningless affirmations. You are valued. You are safe. You are chosen. He fled into the streets. The world outside was too clean. No litter, no noise. Cars glided silently on roads without markings. No birds, no insects, no sound, but the quiet hum of something. Subterranean machines, maybe. Or thoughts too large for human minds. He wandered for hours, or minutes. Time didn't seem to work here. The sky never darkened. He found a bookshop. Every book bore the same author. Doctrine. Every story had the same ending. Obedience. Then he heard it. A song, not sung, whistled, at a jagged melody, off-key, weaving through alleys like a breeze from another dimension. He followed it. It led him underground, to the forgotten city, beneath the perfect streets. Below the curated parks, and scripted smiles, there were tunnels, broken rail lines, sewers that hadn't been cleaned in decades. And people, real people, scarred, wild-eyed, clothed in patchwork, whispering truths like prayers. They called themselves the Index, and they remembered. A woman named Marla approached him. Her face bore tattoos made from language he did not know, but somehow understood. Words that hurt to look at. Words that bled when spoken aloud. You were one of the first. The architects tried to erase you, but something failed. He stared. Why? Because you chose rage, not submission. She brought him to their sanctuary, a vast chamber filled with scavenged screens, old books, analog machines humming with forbidden data. There, on the largest monitor, Somerset's face stared back. It wasn't live footage, it was a recording. Looping, his eyes were hollow, mouth moving slowly, repeating the same word over and over. Remember, they had preserved it, hidden it, protected it like sacred fire. The doctrine had failed to account for one thing. Memory that hurts cannot be fully erased. Mills sank to his knees. What can we do? Marla smiled. Resist. He stayed underground, became one of them. Learned the forgotten arts of subversion. How to slip messages into dreams. How to fracture the narrative through paradox. How to infect the perfect world above with chaos, just enough to create cracks. They called it narrative entropy, and the boy began to notice. He appeared again, not in public, but in minds, dreams, waking visions. He came to Mills one night, in the form of a mirror. You're trying to undo me. Mills stared at him. You were never finished. The boy blinked. His skin began to crack. Not flesh, but porcelain. Underneath, something darker pulsed. You think stories can be rewritten, but every new story requires a sacrifice. Mills didn't flinch. Then I'll bleed. The mirror shattered. Above ground, things began to falter. Advertisements glitched, showing fragments of reality before the rewrite old news footage. Faces of victims, crimes no longer remembered. People began waking with scratches they couldn't explain. Dreams leaked into daylight. Children hummed the lullaby backwards and screamed. When they heard it forward, Se7en appeared again. Not physically, but in text. Books began to manifest in libraries, with no authorship. Just pages of his thoughts, written in his voice, bearing no title. These books had no spine, just a cover that read, "What comes after the Eon de Mills read everyone." They weren't instructions, they were warnings. And a map. The final chapter described a place, a hole in the world. The place where the doctrine had begun. The place where the child had been born. A cathedral at the center of a desert. Where time stopped. He went alone. No one followed. At its center was a pulpit of bone, carved with the names of the original sins. Beneath it, a cradle. Empty. But then it filled. The boy appeared. Older now, his eyes black as wet ash. "I knew you'd come." Mills stepped forward. "You rewrote the world." The boy nodded. "You still bleed for it." Mills smiled. "That's what makes it real." He lifted the blade. It wasn't a weapon, it was memory, and he drove it. Into the world. The cathedral shook, screamed. The doctrine tore, not destroyed. Ruptured. Just enough for something else to get in. A new story. Not better, not safer, but different. And in the city above, people paused, looked around. And for a breath, they remembered they had forgotten. And then the child screamed. Not in pain, in birth, and Se7en's voice returned one final time. "Stories end when the reader walks away, and you're still here. So, choose. What story do you want to bleed for?" The screen goes black, a single line appears. "This is where you begin." The child was on television now, not in interviews or public statements. No one spoke his name. He simply began appearing, never in focus, never in the foreground, but always there. In the grainy background of local news, in the reflections of skyscraper glass during morning traffic reports, in static frames between channels where no broadcast was supposed to exist. The networks denied knowledge. They deleted footage, re-uploaded with empty spaces where he once stood. But those who had seen him remembered, and some began to speak in tongues afterward. Others drew spiral patterns into the walls of their homes, until their fingernails snapped off and blood smeared the plaster. Se7en knew it was happening too fast. Something had been awakened, and now, no longer content with symbols and sermons, it had entered the bloodstream of society, like a virus that had memorized the cadence of human thought. He stopped sleeping. When he closed his eyes, he dreamed of hallways that led into themselves, rooms that never stayed in one place, books that wrote new pages as he turned them. And always, the boy, standing at the far end of some impossible cathedral, head tilted, lips stitched shut with golden thread. The witnesses had been destroyed. One by one they vanished. Not killed, not missing, simply unmade. Photographs of them no longer developed properly, just voids where they once were. Newspaper articles about their arrests came back blank. Even Se7en's corkboard began to lose connections, strings falling away overnight as though embarrassed by what they had once connected. He wrote by hand now, with charcoal, on raw wood. He scrawled names until the letters bled into one another. Then he found Mills again. For real this time. In a hospital whose name was never listed on any public registry. Se7en had driven for 12 hours in a direction that made no sense, following a pattern of roadside billboards that spelled out a sentence when taken in sequence. "Do you want to know what you never dared to be ill?" He found Mills sitting in a chair in a room with no door, face hollowed out by years of something worse than pain, something like revelation. His eyes didn't focus at first. He didn't speak. He simply lifted one hand and tapped his fingers 7 times on the steel table between them. Then once more. The 8th. "You were right, Se7en." His voice was cracked, leather, dry from disuse. "It wasn't about him. It was about what comes after him. They wanted to break something in us. To tear the illusion of meaning down so thoroughly that we'd be grateful when they rebuilt it." Mills looked at him and smiled a humorless smile. Not gods. Not demons. Just people who stopped pretending there was a difference. He held out a photograph. Se7en took it, and his breath caught. It was himself, but not recent, not aged. He was younger, much younger, standing in front of a building he did not remember. And beside him, a woman he did not know, holding a child. The same child. He looked up, heart thudding. What is this? Mills shook his head. I don't know. They said time isn't what we think. That some things move sideways. That stories can choose their authors. Somerset left the room and didn't look back. The city was changing now. Tangibly, people walked in formations, not coordinated, but rhythmic, as though moved by a common metronome. Churches closed their doors, not in protest, but in surrender. Messages appeared on walls in phosphorescent paint, readable only in the darkest hour before dawn. Do not speak his name. Do not sing his song. People did. A song began circulating, a children's lullaby, soft, lilting, in a key that did not belong to any known scale. Children began to hum it without knowing why. Adults dreamed it. In one recorded case, a woman bled from her ears after hearing it played backwards on a scratched vinyl record found in a derelict subway tunnel. Somerset followed the pattern until it led him to the church. It wasn't on any map. It didn't appear on satellite images. But it was there, on the edge of the city, beyond the railway yard where trains no longer ran. Black stone, no windows, a spire that reached high enough to disappear into the fog. He approached without hesitation, the air around it vibrating with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Inside, no pews, no altar, just mirrors, floor to ceiling, every wall. But they didn't show reflections, they showed memories. Fractured, overlapping, wrong. He saw Tracy giving birth in reverse. He saw Doe as a child, drawing the 7 sins in crayon. He saw himself walking through a door that didn't exist, then walking out of it years older. Face gaunt, hands bloody. And then the mirrors shattered. The sound was deafening. Glass fell like rain, cutting his coat, nicking his cheeks. And behind them stood the architects, dozens of them, all masked, all silent. They moved as one, circling him. One stepped forward and removed its mask. It was his own face. You were chosen, Somerset. Not for your goodness, for your capacity to hold despair without breaking. He fell to his knees. Why? Because stories need endings. And you are the reader who became the page. They lifted him. He did not struggle. Outside the church, the child stood, watching. He was not smiling. In that moment, Somerset understood. The doctrine was not a plan. It was a process. A rewriting of moral architecture. The sins had never been warnings. They had been scaffolding. Now, the final structure was nearly complete. They placed a crown on his head, made of iron thorns. He was not king. He was index. The book was now open, and people began to change. Not visibly, but fundamentally. They stopped asking why, stopped needing cause and effect. They accepted that the world did not reward goodness, nor punish evil. It simply moved forward, reshaped by the stories told about it. And the new stories were not about salvation. They were about clarity, about the comfort of inevitability. The child grew older, never aged, just grew. He walked into the United Nations, and every world leader stood. He never spoke. But laws changed. Borders redrew. Faiths collapsed. New temples were built in brutalist stone, windowless, echoing with prayers that had no words, only tone. Somerset lived, kept alive, not as a man, not as a parable. Visitors came to see him, though, seeking meaning in the madness. They asked for wisdom. He told them one thing: there is no meaning, only narrative. And narrative belongs to those willing to bleed for it. One day, the child came to him, sat across from him in a white room with no doors. It's time, William. Time for what? For you to write the final word. Somerset lifted the pen, felt the weight of it, and then he wrote. Not a sermon, not a confession, just one word. Remember. The child read it, then stood. The world paused. Just long enough to exhale, and then everything changed. Books rewritten, history reversed, memories restructured like scaffolding turned to glass. But that one word echoed in those still human enough to fear it. Remember, the child could not erase it, because it was not part of the doctrine. It was the seed of a new one. And somewhere, in the fractured timelines of this rewritten earth, a man named Mills opened his eyes again, found a woman named Tracy, found a child who looked up and smiled. And in that smile was not hope, but the fragile possibility of it. And in a city where rain had once fallen endlessly, the sun rose, for a moment, for a breath, before the world turned again, and the next story began. The city had begun to change, though only a few noticed. It was a shift so slight it slid under the radar of the sane, hiding in shadows and peripheral vision, announcing itself only in the unease one felt when a streetlight flickered in a pattern too precise to be coincidence, or when subway announcements stuttered, stammered, then spoke something in a language no one could name. Somerset noticed, since the desert since Mills had vanished with nothing but the echo of the seventh sin left behind, he had turned his home into something between a bunker and a library. Walls lined with corkboards, yarn, photographs of crime scenes, passages underlined in religious texts, classical paintings printed in grayscale, old newspaper clippings that smelled of mildew and slow decay, and in the center of it all, the photograph of Tracy and the child, both of them staring directly into the camera, neither smiling. He had not returned to the precinct. Officially, he was retired. But official narratives had never comforted him, and now, more than ever, they felt hollow rituals for those who couldn't bear the void. He had made contact with a handful of people, scattered across the country, who whispered similar stories, of cult-like figures in robes, who appeared only to those on the brink of despair, of ritualistic murders staged with the surgical precision, of symphonic movements, of whispers in psychiatric wards that patients spoke of a black church with no doors, no congregation, and no God-only doctrine. It always came back to that word, doctrine, as if these new horrors were being carved into the world with liturgical intent. He found Mills again, or what was left of him, in a small town 500 miles north. It wasn't his body Somerset found, but his voice recorded on a cassette tape mailed in a plain envelope without return address. The tape hissed at the beginning, then cracked into a voice that was shaky, breathless, broken. They took me somewhere beneath. I don't know how long. There are corridors that loop back on themselves. Walls bleed. The lights flicker Morse code. I think I've seen her. Somerset. She walks the halls in white. She never ages. And the child is not right. He looks at me like I'm the aberration. They speak of the eighth Somerset. They say we got the sins wrong. It's not 7. It never was. The eighth is belief, not faith. Belief in systems, in the illusion of order. It binds all others. That's why they hunt those who question. They say the world must be rewritten, with blood. And the child is the pen. Then static. Then silence. Somerset sat in the dark for hours after that. The words drilled into him. Not because they were outlandish, but because they felt too close to truth. The more he read, the more he understood that Doe was never an outlier. He was a symptom, an early bloom in a garden long seeded. He began noticing people watching him. Not overt surveillance. They never stared too long, but faces repeated. A man with a crooked tie at a diner. A girl with heterochromia, who always stood on the corner. By the bookstore, a homeless man whose sign never changed, reading, "The eighth is here." When he finally made contact with the underground network, those who called themselves the witnesses, he found something resembling clarity, though it brought no comfort. They met in the boiler room of an abandoned theater, a decaying Gothic hulk with stained velvet curtains and collapsed balconies. There were 8 of them. They never gave names, just stories. Each had encountered the doctrine in some form. One had escaped from a commune that used mirrors for confessionals. Another had worked for a publishing house that distributed children's books, embedded with code stories, whose conclusions changed with each reading. One had been a Vatican archivist, now gaunt and half-mad, who claimed the doctrine was older than Christianity and had survived every purge, because it had become the purge. They showed Somerset a manuscript, handwritten in crimson ink. No title, just symbols. He recognized some of them, alchemical glyphs, inverted numerals, fragments of Coptic script. But others were older and traceable. The text described a world shaped by sin not as moral failing but as fuel. Every act of cruelty a spark. Every broken man a battery. The child in the photograph wasn't just Mill's son. He was a vessel. A new John, not to bear witness, but to become the word itself. The witnesses had intercepted communications, broadcasts in dead languages, fragments of sermons, stitched into corporate jingles. A storm was coming, they said. Not of fire or flood, but of perception. Reality itself would be bent, rewritten, chapter by chapter. The architects, those faceless orchestrators in black, were not human, in the way Somerset understood. Or perhaps they were simply post-human remnants of an intelligence that had shed empathy like dead skin. And then came the letter. It arrived folded inside a copy of Paradise Lost, dog-eared and weather-worn. The handwriting was precise, the ink dark as dried blood. Deliver yourself. That night, Somerset dreamt of the box again, But when he opened it this time, it contained a mirror, his own face, but younger, smiling, and behind it, a voice he hadn't heard in years. "It's not enough to observe, William. Now you must believe." He awoke with a name in his head, one he hadn't thought of since he was a rookie. Leland Orrin. Orrin had been a professor of comparative theology before he'd snapped. One day he'd walked into a university lecture hall and locked the doors, doused the floor with kerosene, and burned 6 students alive. Claimed he was saving them from becoming vessels. The court declared him insane. Somerset had been the arresting officer. It was one of the first cases that had ever shaken him. Orrin had looked at him as the flames rose and said, "We don't hunt the beast, we feed it, and it thanks us by forgetting." He was still alive. In a maximum security asylum, one Somerset now had a reason to visit. The asylum was not what he expected. No screaming, no chaos, just stillness. A nurse led him down white hallways that hummed with a sound just on the edge of hearing something, like chanting played in reverse. Orrin's cell was more like a chapel. The walls were covered in scripture, not just biblical, but Gnostic, pagan, and from other, nameless texts. In the center, Orrin sat in lotus position, thin as bone, his eyes closed, lips moving silently. When he opened his eyes, he smiled. "The shepherd arrives." Somerset sat. "Tell me about the 8th." Orrin chuckled. A dry, papery sound. "It was never hidden. You just refused to see. The 8th is not sin. It's sacrament. The final page in a book written in agony. And your friend Doe was merely a reader, not an author." Somerset leaned forward. "Who writes it?" Orrin looked up at the ceiling, tears brimming. "The child born from blood, raised in silence. He will speak the final chapter into being. And when he does, words will no longer be bound by language. They will cut." Somerset left in silence, but not before Orrin said one last thing. "When the bells ring backward, find the church that casts no shadow." 2 days later, every bell tower in the city rang at midnight, in reverse, as if the past itself was being summoned. Somerset followed the sound. It led him to an alley he had passed countless times, forgotten, overgrown. At its end, a black door set into a brick wall with no building behind it. He stepped through. Inside was not darkness, but white light, blinding. And then silence. Tracy stood before him, holding the child. But her eyes were not hers. And the child spoke without moving his lips. "You delivered yourself." And then the world fell away. When Somerset awoke, he was in his apartment, or a version of it. On the desk lay a manuscript. He had written it. The final chapter. His handwriting, his signature. But he had no memory of doing so. And at the bottom of the page, in red ink, "Now the book is open." The city burned that night, but no one saw it. The fire was not of flame, but thought. Ideas twisted. Language fragmented. People began speaking in riddles they couldn't understand, their dreams bleeding into waking life. Murders happened with no perpetrators. Children spoke of black-eyed angels whispering through screens. And the child grew. He was not hunted, he was followed. And William Somerset, the quiet detective who once believed evil had a pattern, became the first chapter of a new gospel, not of salvation, but of inversion. And behind it all, always watching, the architects waited for the page to turn. It had rained all night. Not a cleansing rain, not the kind that washed things away, but something more insidious, a slow seep into cracks and alleyways, feeding the rot beneath the city's bones. Detective Somerset sat in the silence of the car. As they drove into the desert, the sun not yet cresting the jagged horizon, Mills was twitchy, agitated, biting his lip and tapping his fingers against the seatbelt. Glancing back at John Doe, who sat with unnatural stillness in the back seat, hands cuffed, head tilted slightly as if listening to some music only he could hear. Somerset didn't speak. His instincts screamed at him this wasn't over. No matter how calm the surface appeared, there was movement beneath, dark and coiled. The drive to the location Doe had given them felt wrong from the beginning. The GPS coordinates pointed to nowhere, miles from anything but heat and silence. Somerset had told the pilot car to hang back. He didn't want too many eyes on this until they knew what they were dealing with. Doe hadn't stopped smiling since they passed the last telephone pole, and Mills, ever the hot-headed partner, had barely held back the urge to slam the brakes and beat it out of him right there on the road. When they arrived, the field was empty. A few low hills broke the monotony, dotted with scrub brush and broken bottles. The skeletons of old electrical towers rusting into the dust. Doe spoke only once. "There. A package, delivered by a van, that disappeared into the heat mirage, sat waiting, near a small outcropping of rocks. Somerset's stomach clenched. He approached it slowly, heart drumming in his ears. The box was wrapped in brown paper. Flies buzzed around it like a curse. He opened it. What he saw inside did not break him. Not yet. But it cracked some small, protected place in his chest where he had stored his belief that evil had boundaries. It wasn't Tracy's head. It wasn't blood, or hair, or flesh. Inside was a photograph. An ultrasound image. Somerset stared. Behind it, a letter, handwritten in an ornate, jagged script that did not match Doe's known handwriting. Deliver him. That was all it said. He turned around slowly. Box still in his hands. Mills was already out of the car, yelling at Doe, who remained motionless and smiling. Somerset's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the wind like a scalpel. He's not the end. Mills didn't hear him. He was shouting, spit flying, pushing Doe against the car hood. But Somerset's gaze was fixed on the figure that now stood atop the nearest hill. So still, he might have been a scarecrow, cloaked in black, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, arms crossed in front of him. Another appeared behind the first. Then two more figures stepping out of the heat, dressed in the same funereal garb. Silent sentinels watching, waiting. Somerset dropped the box. Mills saw them too now. He froze mid-sentence, eyes widening. Who the hell are they? Doe answered in a voice so calm it made Somerset's skin crawl. The architects. Mills raised his gun instinctively. But Somerset grabbed his wrist. Not yet. They were surrounded now. Vehicles emerged from behind the hills and marked black vans. Matte finished and dust-covered, blending into the landscape. Men and women stepped out, all dressed in black. Faces hidden behind masks, with emotionless carved features expressions locked into screams, smiles, sobs. The symbolism struck Somerset hard. It was theater. Grand, grotesque theater. They were standing on a stage they hadn't known existed. One of the masked figures approached, holding something out toward Doe. A key. Doe bowed his head, eyes suddenly wet. I have served. The figure did not speak. Just unlocked the cuffs with a mechanical click and turned to Somerset. He was never the hand. He was the offering. The wind picked up. Dust swirled like a living thing. Doe fell to his knees, eyes closed, whispering something unintelligible. Mills raised his weapon again, but this time, Somerset didn't stop him. He fired twice. Doe fell backward, body twitching in the dust. Smile still etched across his bloodied face. But no one moved to stop them. The figures simply turned and began to walk back, toward the vans. Somerset and Mills stood alone beside the body. But it wasn't over. A low rumble broke the silence. Helicopters, two of them, black as the void, circling overhead, kicking up sand and blinding light. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, calm and inhumanly precise. You have trespassed into a reckoning. You may leave, or stay and learn. Somerset closed his eyes. He knew this had gone too far. This was never about Doe's sins. This was about orchestration, manipulation. Something older than Doe, older than the city, maybe older than guilt itself. Mills was trembling. What the hell is going on, Somerset? He didn't answer. He looked down at the letter again. Deliver him. The pronoun shifted in his mind. It wasn't Doe being delivered. It was someone else. Someone yet to be taken. He looked at Mills. Tracy's not dead. The words came out before he could stop them. Mills blinked. His breath caught. Somerset continued, voice low, controlled. They faked it. They knew you'd kill him. They knew that rage would blind you. But this isn't about vengeance. It's about control. The helicopters began to descend. The wind howled. And Doe was just Act 1. Mills stumbled backward, gun loose in his hands, knees buckling. In the distance, the black-clad figures loaded something into the vans, something long and wrapped in white. Mills ran toward them, screaming Tracy's name. Somerset chased after him, heart pounding. But it was too late. The vans drove off as silently as they had come, disappearing behind the dunes. And then the desert was quiet. The helicopters gone. The box overturned, its contents lost to the wind. Doe's body, already half buried by drifting sand. The outpost of evil had vanished like a mirage. Back in the city, the murders resumed, but they were subtler now. Not flashy sins, not themes. Quiet disappearances. Reports of mass suicides among theologians, philosophers. Somerset started seeing patterns in case files that weren't there before. He spent nights tracing lines between unconnected deaths. finding symmetry where there shouldn't be any. Mills vanished 3 weeks later. His apartment was found ransacked, but nothing was taken, just a single envelope on his desk. Inside was a photograph of Tracy, alive, holding a child, and beneath it, a note. The seventh sin is hope. Somerset left the force, or at least, that's what he told himself. But the case never left him. The deeper he dug, the more he found hints of the architects embedded in religious sects, corporate think tanks, obscure publishing houses. He began to believe that the 7 deadly sins were not warnings. They were instructions, and humanity had followed them like a hymn. One night, a knock came at his door. A young woman, maybe 25, stood there holding a file. She said nothing, just handed it to him and left. Inside were photos, crime scene reports, letters, all referencing something called the Eighth Doctrine. He sat down, poured a glass of bourbon, and read until dawn. And when he finally closed the file, he knew Doe had been only the spark. The fire had only just begun.